Okay, so now we've talked about what is money, let's talk about how we make it. All right, people make money by having a job. That's the easiest way to make money. You go out there, you find yourself a job, and you get some cash. It's something we call salary. And in Australia, we actually have an award wage system, which we'll be looking at in class. So you're actually guaranteed an income for various types of jobs. So that's one way to make some money. Another way is actually benefits from the government. So the government provides a range of benefits to Australian citizens. Some of it you may have heard is, we call it the dole. It's for people who are unemployed or in between work. They can receive a payment from the government. Another way is we actually have family tax benefit B and A. That means that certain families will get benefits from the government to help them raise their family. There's also childcare benefit, so people who've got kids in childcare receive money from the government. The other thing is that you get government benefits from the government in relation to health. Medicare, the government will pay for some of your bill. So there are different ways we get benefits from the government. You can make money by owning your own business. It's a lot of hard work, but a lot of fun. So you can actually own your own business, and that's how you make some money. You can have investments. So you may have heard of people talking about the share market. You can also have a second house. So that means people will pay you rent. So the investments pay you money back. So the way that you make money on shares is that each year, if you own shares, the company will pay you what are called dividends. So if the company makes money, they then share it around their shareholders. You can also make money by trading in the shares as well, so by buying and selling shares. And that's a different type of investment. And as I said, having a second home or a third home, that will actually pay you rent. So you'll actually get money from that. You can also have a trust fund. These are quite rare in Australia, but you may have heard about them on American TV. Certain people live on what's called a trust fund. What that means is that somebody at some point sets some money up for them, either when somebody died, they set up a trust fund for somebody, or when a rich person sets up a trust fund for their child when they're born. And what that means is it's a particular type of fund where you can draw money out as almost a salary. As I said, it's pretty rare in Australia. Trust funds are often used for companies. Sorry, that was my dog. I don't know whether you can hear him. The other way you can get money is you can borrow from a bank, which I talked about on the last presentation, but you make money by borrowing from a bank. So you can borrow money from a bank, build something, and then make money out of that and sell it, and then pay the money back to the bank and still make some money. So there's different ways of making money. But let's talk about how the government makes money. Okay. The government makes money by taxing its citizens. So this is a visual from the budget statement of 2019, where it tells us what the government is actually how the government is actually making its money, and it shows you the different types of taxes we get charged. So you can see here there is actually no GST here, because the GST goes back to the state governments. This is the federal government. I'm hoping you know that there are 3 levels of government. There's the federal government, the state government, and then the local councils. You should know that from, I think you do that in Year 7. Anyway, if not, now you know there are 3 different types of government. This is the highest level of government, and you can see where the tax comes from. So most of the tax comes from what we call income tax. So when you have a job or you own a business, or you've got investments and you actually make money, you actually have to pay some of that money to the government. And as you can see, that's a lot of money that they make, $234 billion a year. So every time we have a job, we're paying money to the government. That's where it comes from. The next biggest here is company and resource rent taxes. That's the same. So if you've got a small business, you have to pay what we call things like salary tax or payroll tax. And if you've got resource rent taxes is the mining taxes. So people who dig up things out of the ground actually have to pay tax to the government, because Australia owns those resources, so we should get some benefit from them digging it out of the ground, really. So you can see that most of the money from the government comes from those 2 areas. Sales taxes are different from GST. They're different types of sales taxes. So there are things on cars and particular types of taxes when we import certain things. So there's that one. That links also to the customs duties. That's the same sort of thing. I'm not going to go into detail. Fuel excise is actually what we pay on fuel. So when we go and fill up our cars with petrol, we actually are paying a tax on that. So that's some good money there. Fringe benefits tax is a particular type of tax for when you have fun, really. So if you work in a business or a company and you take people out for dinner or for lunch in order to have a meeting or to treat them, you actually pay a tax on that, and that's where they get the money from that, which is kind of funny. Superannuation is an important thing, and we were talking about that because, in fact, that actually should have been on the earlier slide, because people can make money from superannuation. When we retire, i.e. that's when we're really old and we've stopped working, we actually draw down on what we call our superannuation fund. So in Australia, when you have a job, you actually have to pay into a superannuation fund. It's compulsory, it's the law, and that's actually forced savings for when you're old. So that means when you stop working, you can actually still have money that comes down. But the problem is that the government actually taxes that. At the moment, it taxes it in and taxes it going out. So, no, it doesn't tax it going in, it taxes it coming out. So you can see that it's actually making some money out of that as well. Superannuation is really important and we should talk about it. We'll do that in class. All right, but this is what we do when we get it. So when people get money, they do several different things. We do consumption. So I've just got a picture there of the Canberra Centre. Consumption is a fancy way of saying we go out and buy stuff. Remember how I talked about goods and services? So consumption is a general word that covers the purchase of goods and services. The other thing we can do with it is we can save it. So we can put it in our piggy bank and save it. And that's always a good thing. So you're saving up for a car, or you're saving up for the future or a holiday. So you actually put the money aside when you receive it. Debt relief is another thing. So remember when I was talking about the credit cards on the last presentation and loans from the banks or loan sharks? Debt relief is what we talk about when we say we're paying that back. So you can see here the person's really happy because they've cut the chain between the debt and themselves. Look, debt's not a bad thing, okay? We do need to have debt. Sometimes people in the media talk about it as being a really bad thing. The country can go into debt as well, so you've heard probably of a budget deficit perhaps. Debt's not necessarily bad. Debt can be good. So to buy a house, you need to go into debt. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are good debt and bad debt. And paying it back is a really, really good idea. And as I said on the last slide, we've got to pay those taxes. So that's what happens when we get our money. So when we get our money, regardless of whether we're getting it from investments or our own business or a job, this is kind of all the things we do with it. We just do those things. We don't really do anything else. Unless, of course, you stuff it in a mattress. I don't know. What does the government actually do with it when they get it? Well, this is the things that they provide to us, okay? So here the biggest spend you can see is Social Security and welfare. So it's in relation to, when I was talking on the first slide about where we get our income from. So that's things like, the dole, family tax benefit A and B, childcare, health, all those sorts of things. That's where that money comes from, okay, or where it goes to. And as you can see, it's a lot of money that the government hands out every year in order to support people who are in a different position or meet certain requirements of the government. You can see here now we spend on health, so that's hospitals, things like that, education, after all you're in a school. But what's really interesting and important to remember is that this is the federal government and your school's actually paid for by the ACT government. Some of the money does come from the federal government, but most of it comes from the ACT government. So this is the different levels of government again. So it can get murky about who's paying for what. Defence services, obviously, that's important. General public services, I don't know what's included in that, but a range of other things. And other purposes is probably things like supporting the bureaucracies and things like that. Okay, so that's what the government does with the money. Now, this is a little bit complicated and you don't have to know this, but I think it's actually kind of a cool way to think about money. So stay with me. We can actually work out what the income is for Australia, and we call that the gross domestic product, the GDP. And every year the GDP is worked out for Australia. So we work out what people earn, what the government earns, and now we're talking about what does Australia earn. All right, so what's Australia's income? And we can actually do it in a mathematical formula, which I'm going to step you through. The Y represents the income for Australia, gross domestic product. I don't know why we put a Y there, but we do. It's just a representation. So that Y represents the income for Australia. The C here represents the consumption that we all do. Okay, so when we go to the shops, every time we go to the shops and spend money on a good or a service, it's recorded and it becomes a part of the income for Australia. The I stands for investment. And that's actually when a business goes out there and buys a factory or they buy a new machine. So when a business goes out there and buys a new computer in order to be able to run their business better, that's actually counted as investment. It's not counted as consumption because they're investing in the future of that business. The other thing that's included in that I is your mortgage. Not your mortgage, obviously, but people's mortgages. Sorry. So when we buy a house, it's counted in the I, it's not counted in the C. And the reason why it's counted in the I is because it's expected to have future value. So it's expected to have benefit in the future. But it is counted in that year and it counts in a slightly different way, which is why it's under the I and not under the C. G is what the government spends. So we separate what the government spends from what the individuals spend, and that's that money there. So now we've got the income for Australia equals what we buy plus what businesses and individuals invest plus what the government spends. Now this is where it gets tricky. X and M. So X tells us about exports, M tells us about imports. So export and imports are things that we sell or buy from overseas. So for example, Australia sells a lot of coal overseas. So that's an export. So we export coal overseas. So we are selling coal overseas. However, we buy PlayStations from overseas into Australia. We don't make PlayStations in Australia, they come from overseas. So we import them. So our income for Australia is the difference between what we sell when we export, so how much we sell to other people, minus how much we're buying from other people. Okay, and it's called the trade deficit. You don't need to remember that, but that's what it's called. And what that tells us is sometimes X is actually bigger than M, which means that's a positive number and it adds to our income. Sometimes the imports are higher than the exports, which makes this a negative number, which means it takes away from our income. All right. So when you're buying things, it can be advantageous, it can be a good thing to buy Australian made, because that means you're actually adding to Australia's income overall, versus buying from overseas where you're actually sending our money overseas and taking away from our income. Having said that, PlayStations aren't made in Australia, so you need to buy them from overseas. All right, so sometimes it's just important to work out what you're spending your money on and where that money is going. As I said, you don't have to remember this. I just think it's a cool way to think of income, because we have income for individuals and we make choices about how we spend. Then the government has income, they make choices about how they spend. But then Australia also has an income, and that's determined by the choices that we make as individuals, as businesses, and as a government. All right, so I just think that's kind of cool. And the reason why I think it's kind of cool is because the GDP is a measure that we use on a global scale as to how awesome or not awesome Australia is. So I think that's kind of cool. I hope you do too. Thanks.